What if 3 separate wars, fought on 3 separate continents, just quietly became one single conflict overnight, without most of the world even noticing it happening? Stay with me, because this is genuinely one of the strangest weeks this region has seen in years. Hit subscribe, tap that like button, and send this to someone who still thinks these conflicts are happening in isolation from each other, because after watching this video, they genuinely won't think that anymore. For months, the fighting between the United States, Israel, and Iran has played out mostly through airstrikes, missile exchanges, and a careful, deliberate distance kept by the countries sitting nearby. Saudi Arabia, in particular, spent years perfecting a delicate balancing act, absorbing pressure from Iranian-backed groups without ever formally stepping into the fight itself. That balancing act just ended. In the final days of July 2026, Saudi Arabia openly joined the United States in direct military action against Iranian-backed forces, marking the first time in this entire conflict that Riyadh has publicly put its own air force into a joint offensive strike. This wasn't a symbolic gesture or a diplomatic statement. It was fighter jets in the sky, precision munitions on real targets, and a line that had held for years finally breaking. To understand why this particular moment matters so much, it helps to remember how this whole confrontation actually started in the first place. The wider war between the United States, Israel, and Iran began back in late February 2026, unfolding gradually over the following months into a sprawling, multi-front confrontation stretching from Iranian territory itself all the way through Iraq, the Gulf, and the wider Red Sea corridor. For most of that period, Saudi Arabia stayed carefully positioned on the margins, absorbing occasional strikes, intercepting incoming drones and missiles, but never publicly stepping into offensive operations of its own. That pattern is exactly what changed in the last week of July. What pushed Saudi Arabia past that line wasn't some abstract political calculation. It was a direct attack on the beating heart of the country's oil industry. Late in July, Saudi energy infrastructure came under a renewed wave of drone attacks, with reports pointing to an attempted strike on facilities connected to Abqaiq, the massive processing complex widely considered the single most important piece of oil infrastructure on the planet, responsible for stabilizing a significant share of the crude that eventually reaches global markets. The attack didn't succeed in the way its planners likely intended, but the attempt itself was enough. When the country that anchors so much of the world's energy supply gets targeted directly, threats stop being theoretical and policy stops being cautious, no matter how carefully that policy was built over the preceding years. United States Central Command laid out the justification plainly in an official statement. The joint operation, conducted alongside Saudi forces, came in direct response to more than 30 separate drone attacks launched over roughly a 72-hour window, attacks CENTCOM attributed to militias operating under Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps direction. In other words, a rapid, sustained barrage aimed at both American forces in the region and Saudi energy assets became the final straw. Saudi Arabia formally invoked its right to self-defense, and for the first time since this entire conflict began, Riyadh stepped fully onto the battlefield alongside Washington rather than standing carefully behind it, a shift that took years of quiet groundwork to finally produce in public. So how did this joint operation actually unfold, and which targets did it actually hit? The coordination required between 2 separate air forces operating in the same contested airspace is not a small logistical undertaking. And what happened over the following 2 nights showed just how tightly integrated American and Saudi military planning has quietly become. The retaliatory strikes launched on the 28th and 29th of July focused primarily on Iraq, specifically on facilities connected to Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces, an umbrella network of militias that has functioned for years as one of Iran's most valuable sources of operational depth inside a neighboring country. Aircraft from the Royal Saudi Air Force flew in direct coordination with American Central Command assets, moving into Iraqi airspace alongside U.S. forces in a way that had never been publicly acknowledged before this specific operation. The targets weren't confined to a narrow stretch of border territory either. Strikes reportedly extended across a wide swath of the country, hitting sites in and around Baghdad, along with command and logistics facilities spread across multiple provinces, including areas in the country's north and south. Iraq's own Popular Mobilization Forces confirmed that its command centers had been hit, reporting an initial toll of roughly 20 fighters killed and more than 30 wounded across strikes, conducted in at least 7 separate provinces. Some reporting has suggested that among those killed were a small number of Iranian military advisors directly connected to the Revolutionary Guard Corps, a detail that, if accurate, suggests these strikes reached well beyond ordinary proxy fighters and touched Iran's own command and technical presence embedded inside Iraq. Iraq's own government convened an emergency national security session in response, with the prime minister warning of the fragile position his own country now occupies, caught squarely between an ally it depends on for security support and a set of armed factions operating inside its own borders that his government has struggled for years to bring fully under state control. One senior militia commander reportedly responded defiantly to renewed government pressure over these weapons, mocking any suggestion that Baghdad could simply order armed factions to disarm. Saudi officials reportedly pointed to radar tracking data showing that the drones aimed at oil facilities in the country's eastern and central regions had originated from deep inside Iraqi territory, giving Riyadh what it considered solid grounds to expand its operational reach that far beyond its own borders under the framework of legitimate self-defense. The speed and precision with which Saudi aircraft reached these targets, working in step with American command infrastructure that took years to build, says a great deal about just how far defense cooperation between the two countries has quietly advanced behind the scenes, largely out of public view, until this particular operation forced it into the open. But Iraq wasn't the only front Saudi Arabia found itself confronting during this same stretch. Well before the strikes near Baghdad, tension had already been building along Saudi Arabia's southern border, where Yemen's Houthi movement escalated its own campaign against Saudi shipping and infrastructure. Reports describe a Houthi declaration effectively threatening any commercial vessel bound for Saudi ports or connected to Saudi companies, a threat that translated into actual missile strikes against tankers moving through Red Sea waters. Saudi forces responded with strikes of their own against Houthi military positions inside Yemen, targeting facilities and installations tied to the group's missile and drone capabilities. The Houthis, for their part, attempted retaliatory strikes against Saudi energy facilities using a mix of ballistic, missiles, and drone swarms, though Saudi air defense systems reportedly intercepted at least some of the incoming projectiles before they could do serious damage. Saudi Arabia has publicly stated its own forces destroyed several drones aimed at other major oil-producing sites in the kingdom's east, part of a broader pattern in which barely a week has passed recently without some new attempted strike against Saudi energy infrastructure from one direction or another. Whatever the precise details of every individual strike and counterstrike along that southern front, the pattern is unmistakable. Saudi Arabia found itself facing pressure simultaneously from the north, through Iranian-backed militias operating inside Iraq, and from the south, through the Houthi movement in Yemen, an attempt, whether coordinated deliberately or simply overlapping by circumstance, to squeeze the kingdom from two directions at once. And in both cases, Riyadh's response broke sharply from its previous pattern of quiet restraint. Reports have even suggested that Saudi forces conducted earlier, less publicized strikes against Iranian-linked targets inside Iraq during an earlier phase of this conflict, carried out quietly and without the kind of public acknowledgement that accompanied this latest round. If accurate, that would mean Riyadh's willingness to act militarily didn't appear overnight, so much as it finally stepped into the open after months of far quieter groundwork. Zoom out from the individual strikes for a moment and look at what this actually represents strategically. For years, Saudi Arabia pursued a deliberate policy of avoiding direct confrontation, absorbing periodic attacks without dramatic public retaliation, betting that restraint would keep the kingdom out of the center of a wider regional war. That calculation appears to have shifted decisively. By stepping directly into joint offensive operations, Riyadh has sent an unmistakable signal to every actor in the region that further attacks on its energy. Infrastructure or sovereign territory will now be met with direct military force rather than quiet diplomatic protest. It's also worth noting what this does to the broader security relationship between Washington and Riyadh. Operating in genuinely coordinated joint strikes, sharing targeting data, and flying missions together inside contested airspace represents a level of operational trust between the two militaries that simply didn't exist in this kind of visible, acknowledged form even a year earlier. That shift matters well beyond this single operation too, because it effectively rewrites the security architecture governing an entire region for however long the current alignment holds, and every other actor watching, from Tehran to Baghdad to the wider Gulf, now has to recalculate its own assumptions about what a Saudi response actually looks like going forward. For Iran, this outcome looks a lot like the opposite of what its strategy was presumably designed to achieve. The pattern of pressuring Saudi Arabia through proxy forces, rather than direct state-to-state confrontation, was likely meant to keep Riyadh cautious and hesitant, isolating the United States as the primary target while avoiding pulling the wider Gulf directly into the fight. Instead, the strikes on Abqaiq and the sustained drone barrage over that 72-hour window appear to have done the opposite, pulling Saudi Arabia's own military apparatus directly into the center of the conflict and testing the practical limits of Iran's proxy-based strategy against a target now willing to strike back directly rather than merely defend. There's a genuine irony sitting underneath all of this, too. A strategy built specifically to avoid provoking Saudi Arabia into open confrontation appears to have accomplished exactly the opposite outcome, drawing Riyadh further into this fight than years of quieter proxy pressure ever managed to. We're just getting into how far this has actually spread. So if you want to understand why oil markets reacted the way they did, and why this story reaches all the way to a lake on the other side of the region, stick around, because the next part connects pieces most coverage has kept completely separate. Global energy markets, unsurprisingly, reacted almost immediately to this rapidly expanding situation. Brent crude prices climbed sharply on the news, driven by genuine concern over the security of supply coming out of one of the most consequential oil-producing regions on the planet. Iranian pressure on shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, combined with escalating Houthi activity in the Red Sea, created exactly the kind of dual choke point risk that energy markets have spent years quietly dreading. Two of the most strategically vital maritime corridors on Earth simultaneously under threat within the same narrow window of time. Traders who track this region closely understand something that rarely makes it into casual coverage of oil prices, that the actual physical supply of crude matters less in these moments than the perceived reliability of the routes used to move it. A tanker that never gets hit still faces higher insurance costs and longer, more cautious routing the moment enough vessels nearby start getting targeted, and that friction alone is enough to ripple through prices at the pump on the other side of the planet. Even so, Saudi Arabia's modern air power, built around a fleet that includes advanced fourth and fifth generation fighter aircraft, appears to have inflicted real, measurable damage on the logistics networks, training camps, and underground storage facilities that keep Iranian-backed militias supplied and operational inside Iraq. The message underneath that operational outcome is fairly direct. The supply lines Iran has spent years quietly building to arm its regional proxy network are no longer treated as untouchable and are now, very clearly, considered legitimate targets by both Saudi and American air power. And remarkably, this entire expanding conflict didn't stay confined neatly to the Middle East at all. In one of the more genuinely surprising developments of this stretch of fighting, Ukraine, a country fighting an entirely separate war against Russia thousands of kilometers away, found a way to directly insert itself into this same widening confrontation. Ukrainian forces carried out a long-range drone strike against an Iranian-flagged cargo vessel in the Caspian Sea, a body of water that borders Russia, Iran, and several Central Asian states, but not Ukraine itself. Kyiv identified the vessel, named the Anna, as part of a supply chain moving military cargo, specifically drone and missile components, from Iranian ports toward Russia. In direct support of the war effort, Ukraine has been fighting against Moscow for more than 4 years now. The strike reportedly caused an explosion aboard the vessel, killing one Iranian crew member and injuring several others. Iranian officials responded with genuine fury, summoning Ukraine's diplomatic representative and issuing public statements describing the strike as an act that could not go unanswered, framing it as a direct violation of Iranian sovereignty and international law. Iran's foreign minister reportedly went further, accusing Israel of deliberately provoking the strike in an attempt to drag Europe further into a war that has, until now, remained largely confined to the Middle East. Ukraine's own government pushed back firmly against that characterization, with President Zelensky publicly confirming that Ukrainian forces had achieved what he described as very strong results from long-range strikes in the Caspian, explicitly targeting vessels involved in moving military cargo between Iran and Russia. Ukraine's foreign minister added that Iran's threats were, in his words, unjustified and groundless, rejecting Tehran's framing of the strike as an attack on ordinary civilian commerce. Zelensky went further, publicly connecting the two wars directly, stating that Ukrainian intelligence had observed active Russian satellite surveillance of Gulf states and American military positions in the region since early July, imagery that Ukrainian officials say subsequently appeared being used by Iran, both ahead of Iranian strikes and afterward, apparently to assess resulting damage. If that claim holds up under further scrutiny, it suggests something genuinely significant, that Russia and Iran may be actively sharing real-time intelligence across two conflicts that, until recently, most people assumed were running on entirely separate tracks. This wasn't even the first time Ukraine had reached into the Caspian corridor either. Ukrainian forces had previously struck other vessels and infrastructure connected to the same Iran to Russia supply route, including an earlier strike on a Russian warship, and a pair of sanctioned cargo ships also accused of ferrying military cargo across those same waters, along with strikes on Russian oil rigs operating in the same body of water months earlier. Taken together, this pattern shows a deliberate, sustained Ukrainian effort to treat the entire Iran to Russia military supply corridor as a legitimate target set, regardless of how far that corridor sits from Ukraine's own borders, and regardless of whose flag happens to be flying on any individual vessel caught up in it. That strategy fits inside a much broader Ukrainian campaign too, one that has reportedly struck Russian refineries close to 200 times since the start of this year alone, an effort that has knocked UTA a substantial share of Russia's overall refining capacity and triggered real fuel shortages and rationing inside Russia itself. Seen against that backdrop, the Caspian strike looks less like an isolated, opportunistic attack, and more like the logical extension of a strategy Ukraine has been steadily building for months, simply applied for the first time against a target flying an Iranian flag instead of a Russian one. What makes this Caspian strike particularly significant isn't simply the tactical result, one damaged vessel and one Iranian casualty. It's what the strike represents symbolically. Iran has spent years treating the Caspian as something close to its own secure backyard, a body of water shared only with a small handful of neighboring states, largely insulated from the wider conflicts playing out across the Middle East and Europe. This strike shattered that assumption entirely, demonstrating that Iran's logistics networks are not safe anywhere, not in the Gulf, not in the Red Sea, and now, not even in waters it had long treated as effectively its own. For a country already absorbing direct strikes from the United States, Israel, and now Saudi Arabia simultaneously, discovering that a fourth country entirely, one fighting its own separate war against Russia, can reach into the same strategic vulnerability adds an entirely new dimension of pressure that Tehran's military planners likely never fully accounted for. Iran's response to all of this has been to lean further into its relationship with Moscow, rather than retreat from it. Senior Iranian officials have reportedly framed the Caspian strike as effectively an act of war against Iranian territorial integrity, with some warning of potential retaliation against Ukrainian energy and military infrastructure that, after more than 4 years of sustained Russian bombardment, is already under enormous strain. Deepening cooperation between Tehran and Moscow, evident already through Iran's supply of drone technology that Russia has used extensively against Ukrainian cities throughout this war, appears to be pulling Iran closer to becoming a direct, acknowledged party inside the European theater of conflict as well, rather than remaining merely a distant supplier operating quietly in the background. Step back and look at the full shape of what's actually happening here, because it's genuinely unlike anything this region has seen in a long time. Iran is currently absorbing pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. American and Israeli strikes continue hitting targets connected to Iran's own territory and military infrastructure. Saudi Arabia has now stepped directly into offensive operations against Iranian-backed proxies inside Iraq. The Houthi movement's campaign against Saudi shipping has drawn Riyadh into active combat along its southern border as well. And now, thousands of kilometers away, Ukraine has demonstrated it can reach directly into Iran's own maritime supply lines whenever it identifies a legitimate military target, regardless of how far that target sits from Ukrainian territory. Every one of these pressure points exists somewhat independently on paper, yet all of them are converging on the exact same regime, at the exact same moment, compounding a strain that would be difficult for any single military to absorb even one front at a time. It's worth remembering that most modern militaries, even well-resourced ones, are built and trained around managing one serious crisis at a time, not 4 simultaneous ones spread across 3 separate bodies of water and 2 separate continents. That convergence raises a genuinely important question worth sitting with for a moment. For years, most analysis of global conflict treated these as separate, largely unconnected stories. A war in Ukraine here, tension in the Gulf there, periodic flare-ups in Yemen and Iraq treated almost as background noise. What's unfolding right now suggests that framework may no longer hold up. Iran's alliance with Russia, built initially around drone technology transfers, meant to support Moscow's war against Ukraine, has apparently created a supply corridor now treated by Kyiv as fair game regardless of geography directly, tying Iran's own war with the United States and Israel to Ukraine's ongoing fight for survival against Russian invasion. Saudi Arabia's decision to finally step off the sidelines ties the Gulf security picture directly into the same widening web. What used to look like 3 or 4 separate regional stories increasingly looks like a single interconnected conflict with different fronts, different combatants, and different headlines, but a common thread running underneath almost all of it. Before we get to what happens next, take a second and subscribe if this kind of connected, big picture analysis is what you come here for, because untangling exactly how these fronts overlap is going to matter enormously in the weeks ahead. So where does this actually go from here? A few things are worth watching closely over the coming weeks. First, whether Saudi Arabia's decision to step directly into offensive operations represents a genuine, lasting shift in regional posture or a targeted temporary response specifically to the Abqaiq-related threat that prompted it. Countries. With as much at stake as Saudi Arabia rarely abandon decades of careful strategic caution overnight without expecting that shift to hold for a while. If Riyadh continues conducting joint strikes alongside American forces in the weeks ahead, that tells you this wasn't a one-time reaction, but a genuine recalibration of how the kingdom intends to defend itself going forward, one likely to shape Gulf security policy for years rather than weeks. Second, watch what Iran actually does in response to the Caspian Sea strike specifically. Threats of retaliation against Ukrainian infrastructure are one thing to state publicly. Actually following through, especially while simultaneously managing active fronts against the United States, Israel, and now Saudi Arabia, is a considerably more difficult proposition. If Iran does attempt to strike Ukrainian targets directly, even through intermediary Russian capability, that would represent a genuine widening of this war in a way that pulls European security directly into a conflict that started as a Middle Eastern confrontation. If it doesn't, that tells you something meaningful too, about just how stretched Iran's actual capacity to project force across multiple simultaneous fronts has become, and about how much of Tehran's public rhetoric right now may simply be posturing meant to preserve some appearance of deterrence rather than a genuine, actionable plan. Third, keep an eye on global energy markets because they remain one of the clearest real-time indicators of how seriously the world is actually taking this escalation. Sustained pressure on both the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea simultaneously represents a genuinely rare convergence of risk across two of the most strategically vital maritime corridors on the planet at the same time. If oil prices continue climbing rather than stabilizing, that tells you markets believe this conflict is still expanding rather than winding down, regardless of what individual governments say publicly about their intentions. It's also worth remembering that markets tend to price in fear well before any single decisive event actually happens, which means sustained upward pressure on crude prices over the coming weeks may end up being one of the earliest, clearest signals of where this entire situation is actually heading, well ahead of any official government statement confirming it. And finally, watch Iraq itself. Caught directly in the middle of all of this, its own territory used as a staging ground for militia attacks against Saudi Arabia, and now absorbing direct joint strikes from two foreign militaries operating inside its own borders. A weak central government struggling to assert genuine control over armed factions operating on its own soil is exactly the kind of instability that tends to make an already volatile regional situation considerably harder to contain, let alone resolve through any kind of diplomatic off-ramp. Iraq's leadership finds itself in a genuinely impossible position here, dependent on both American security guarantees and a working relationship with Iran, while militias operating on its own soil answer to neither government with any real consistency. That contradiction has been quietly building for years, and this latest round of joint strikes has only pulled it further into the open. What's happening across this region right now genuinely reshapes how you should think about modern warfare and modern alliances more broadly. A drone launched from inside Iraq threatens an oil facility inside Saudi Arabia. Saudi and American jets respond together in coordinated strikes deep inside Iraqi territory. A Ukrainian drone, launched in support of an entirely separate war against Russia, finds and destroys an Iranian vessel and a map without help. None of these individual actions look connected if you only watch one headline at a time. Put together, they describe something considerably larger, a world where regional conflicts no longer stay contained within their original borders or their original combatants, where a supply line connecting one war to another instantly becomes a legitimate target in both, and where a decades-old policy of careful restraint can collapse in the span of a single week, once the right facility gets targeted by the wrong drone. Saudi Arabia spent generations building a reputation for careful, calculated restraint, absorbing pressure quietly rather than escalating publicly. That reputation just changed in a matter of days over an attack on a single stretch of energy infrastructure that the entire global economy quietly depends on. Iran, meanwhile, is discovering in real time just how far its web of regional influence actually extends, and just how exposed every strand of that web becomes once enough of its adversaries decide, all at roughly the same moment, that quiet restraint is no longer the price of doing business. Think about the sheer geography involved in just this 1 week alone. A processing facility in Saudi Arabia's eastern province, command centers scattered across 7 Iraqi provinces, missile sites tucked into Yemen's western coastline, and a single cargo vessel sailing quietly across a landlocked sea most people would struggle to even point to on a map, thousands of kilometers away from any of it. 4 completely different locations, 4 completely different sets of combatants, and yet every single one of them traces back to the same underlying conflict, the same handful of alliances, and the same fundamental question about how far Iran's influence can actually stretch before it starts breaking under its own weight. Whatever comes next in this rapidly expanding confrontation, one thing already looks unmistakably true. The lines that used to separate these conflicts geographically, politically, and militarily are dissolving faster than almost anyone expected. And the next flashpoint in this widening war could just as easily emerge from a Gulf oil facility, a Yemeni missile site, an Iraqi command center, or a quiet stretch of water on the far side of the region that almost nobody was watching until very recently. The old assumption that these were separate wars, fought by separate countries, over separate grievances, no longer holds up under any real scrutiny. What we're actually watching is one interconnected conflict wearing several different disguises at once, and the moment more people start recognizing that pattern, the clearer the next several months of this story are likely to become.